Okay, Angelica, let's go over your essay. This is a really good start for how concerned you were about this essay. I think it's a really, really good way to begin this essay. The one thing that I would say is that 11 pages is crazy long for this essay. We're looking for 4 to 6 pages, and I'm going to try to keep you in those 4 to 6 pages. The trick is that if your thesis is designed in the right way, you should be able to figure out how much you have to write to hit that 4 to 6 pages, and you want to try to find that sweet spot between 4 and 6. If you're writing 11 pages, that means that there's probably a lot of stuff in here that you just don't need, and it turned out that that's true. So I'm going to try to walk through and show you the things that you need. Um, okay, so up here, this is just what it should look like: full name, class, the section, my name, and the date. Up here, you're always going to have your last name and the page number, and this should be on every single page. So last name, page number on every page. Um, you want the title to be something creative because the title, just like the first couple of lines of your introduction, is part of the hook, right? So remember that every introduction has a hook. That's the thing that kind of grabs the reader's attention. Then it gives you a little bit of context because it explains sort of what is your professor asking you to write about. You give a little bit of foundation and background information. Then you begin to kind of preview what's going to be most important in your thesis. And then finally, you have your thesis, right? Now here I put, of the things that you do here, I think that you have the preview to your thesis and you have your thesis, but you don't really have a hook and you don't really have a lot of context, right? So you just say, you just start right off the bat with Superman. Since Superman uses bravery and not fear to sacrifice himself to save others, he represents the idea of sacrifice, which is an American value to let people know that by helping people successfully, Superman's hard work pays off. Okay. Now, one of the things we've got to do is we've got to work on the wordiness of your sentences. Some of them kind of say the same thing over and over, and they're really long. So I want you to get in the habit of finding a quiet place, and I want you to read out loud. Because you'll hear when a sentence just keeps going on too long, you'll hear and you'll be like, whoa, I got to stop that. And the other thing you might think about doing is giving a friend or a family member or something a highlighter and having them read the essay. And anytime they hit a sentence that just keeps going on and on and on, have them highlight those sentences. And then you can go back in and try to break them up into a couple of different sentences instead of one that just keeps going as a run on, right? Um, so here, you just said the hard work paid off. You don't have to say what that means. I think everybody knows what it means when hard work pays off. As a result, Superman is a benefit to the community. That's the end of the sentence. And by doing a good deed, this is an interrupter phrase because this is in the middle of the sentence. Because these are two complete sentences here, you've got to use the comma and the fanboy together. So, right, so remember that that's the fanboy rule, is that you can bring together two complete sentences, but if you put them together, you either have to use, so remember we use SVO for complete sentences, subject, verb, object, right? So if we're going to bring these together, we either have to use the comma and a fanboy, and that can be for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. You can use a semicolon, or you can use a colon. And we'll talk about places where you might want to use one or the other. Here, I think it's fine just to have the comma and the fanboy. I think that that's okay. But this is really abrupt because it doesn't really introduce anything. It just kind of dives right into Superman, bravery, sacrifice, right? So we need some kind of hook and we need a little bit of context. So let me just kind of talk you through what this might look like. When I look at your thesis, I think that the most important things is this idea of sacrifice, the idea of sacrificing for the community to define the American way. I'm not convinced by this argument. You make the argument that Batman does not sacrifice, and I completely disagree. And I think that there's a lot of evidence to show that he does sacrifice. But I think that the big thing that you're talking about, the difference is this using fear as a weapon versus using hope as a weapon, right? Okay. So if that's the thing that you really need to introduce in this introduction, we want to just use something to kind of grab the reader's attention. And then we want to give a little bit of information about the prompt, and then we can get into this and then into this, right? So it might be something like, when I was a kid growing up, I remember that superhero comics were so naive in the way that they talked about hope. It seemed like if you just wished hard enough that the good would always prevail. But the truth is that the world that we live in today shows that that's not true at all. Okay, so that's just my hook. It's just to kind of grab the reader's attention, right? Now I'm going to kind of introduce the context, the prompt. So I might say something like, not only is this true of the world we live in today, but it's also true of the world from the 1930s when the superhero was first invented. Um, Folks wanted to believe that they could be hopeful, that they could face these really scary moments like the Great Depression and World War II. And so they use this really idealistic character like Superman to show that that hope would pay off, right? However, even in that particular moment, that was a little bit too naive, right? And then you can begin to introduce this, right? Superman certainly uses the idea of bravery and sacrifice, right? And the idea of like that hard work pays off, right? But in the world that we live in today, that's more jaded and more pessimistic, as opposed to Superman, Batman uses fear as a weapon, right? And then you could introduce your thesis. Here you say that Batman is not brave and does not sacrifice. And I think that both of those things, there's just tons of evidence in the text to prove that that's not true, that he is in fact very brave and that he does in fact sacrifice, or else he wouldn't put on the costume. You know, how many times did he get shot and stabbed and beat up, right? Because he keeps going out there to try to keep making the world a better place. So he's certainly sacrificing. But I think that the key thing, the key difference between the two that you're talking about is that idea of hope as a weapon versus fear as a weapon, and why we might want to use fear as a weapon. Okay. So I thought that this was a really good place to start, this big body paragraph. When I flipped the page, I realized that you were doing this on every single page. You don't do any of this stuff except for only on the first page, right? So you don't have to put these in the header, right? These just start your essay. The only thing that should be in the header is this, because you want that to appear on every page, right? So take this out. The page should kind of start up here, and then you're going to have this at the top. Okay, so you started with this paragraph. I thought this was a fine place to begin. Remember that the way that the paragraph works is that you give me a main idea, and that main idea, just like a thesis, has a topic, a stance, and a so what. Okay. Now this main idea tells, right? So when we think about that model, right, the main idea is the most narrow part of that paragraph because it's making a very specific claim. And then here in the middle, where it begins kind of opening up a little bit, this is where you need to show, and you're going to back this claim up, whatever you just told me, you're going to back that up with some concrete details, some concrete evidence, right? And then finally here at the bottom, this is the place where you show me your purpose, right? So, okay, I've just told you something, right? And I've proved it using really good examples. Now I'm going to explain, what does this have to do with my essay, my purpose, right? Now, this paragraph starts out really good. And the only thing I would argue is that, one, we need to be concise. You have this thing where you use all this language that you just don't need. Let me give you an example. Superman is an ideal person, a motivated leader, and an important leader to us to learn from him instead of just reading about him, because Superman in the story inspires many people. You don't need all that. You can just say, you know, an important leader for us to learn from because he inspires people. Done. Right? Same thing down here, like all this language you just don't need. We need concrete examples here, concrete examples here, right? Where you make claims, you've told me something, and now you have to show using the text that we talked about in class. And this is one of the major things in this essay, is that you use almost no evidence to support your claims. And then it gets really repetitive, where you kind of just start to repeat the same thing over and over without using any concrete details. So this first paragraph is good. You make a good claim. Now we need some really concrete examples. So let me give you an example. You say kids can learn about how Supermans are important, or how superheroes are important to our lives, and what reasonable lesson they can learn from superheroes that can inspire them to do right deeds. And then right off the bat, you can be like, you know, in Captain America, we meet the young boy Bucky, and Bucky is told that as long as he does he follows the superhero's example, then he can be a hero too. This shows the reader that you want to kind of explain, right? Remember that when you're using titles, This is going to be underlined or italicized, right? Because this is a complete thing. You're only going to put quotations around something that's very small, like a poem, short story, fairy tale, tiny thing, right? Um, this is a run-on because you have these two complete sentences. This is a great place to use the semicolon. So remember with the semicolon rule, the second sentence is so related to the first that without the first sentence, it wouldn't even make any sense. And then you have this beautiful subordinating conjunction. Here it's that for example, right? That prefaces the next sentence. It's an introductory phrase. So you need to use that comma after that, right? But again, here on the side, I said, don't just say this stuff. You've said a lot of things in here, but now you have to prove it and you have to use evidence to prove it, right? Watch your subject-verb agreement. If superheroes is plural, the verb needs to be plural too. So it's superheroes are, not superhero is. Superheroes is. So here I just put there's a lot of telling here and not a lot of proving. However, this is a useful place to begin, right? Now, when I turn the page, so we're on page 3 now, and again, you don't need any of this. None of this stuff here, here, or here is really helping your argument at all. You get into this whole thing about the sun and the yellow sun and the red sun, and none of that material really supports your thesis at all, right? You start off by saying that you're going to talk about sacrifice specifically. And so if this is the paragraph where you really want to focus on sacrifice, rather than telling me all of this stuff, just dive into some good examples. Show me how Superman ends the war. Show me Action Comics about, Superman is an alien. He has no reason to fight for Americans, but he still sacrifices because he believes it's the right thing to do, right? So that's another example of a place where we need more concrete examples, right? So certainly, the only thing that can be in this paragraph is something that specifically backs this claim up, and I don't think any of those things do. Remember that when you use a quotation, there's only a few of them in here. You need way more quotations, but when you use a quotation, it's always going to be the author's last name and then the page number. So if this comes from the Superman comic, it would be something like Schuster, and then you would have like the page number, period, whatever the page number might be. The period comes here, it doesn't come here. But again, more of these examples, right? Who versus that? Who is for subjects? That is for objects, right? So when I'm walking my dog in East Oakland and people say, what kind of a dog is that? I say she is a pit bull because she thinks with her brain. She's a sentient being, right? She's not an object. So when I'm talking about people that think, and here even bad people think, right? We're going to use who, we're not going to use that. And to be clear, you do this thing where you talk a lot about bad and good, right? At the college level, we got to define what you mean by those things, right? There is no just good and just bad, but it's usually like a lot of in between, right? Now, the question is, if you're talking about bad people, what makes them bad? Are they selfish? Are they violent? Are they illogical? Are they, whatever it may be that makes them bad? You have to be more specific and really explain that, right? Here I put, now start telling us how this relates to the hero's purpose. So you've talked a little bit about sacrifice, but you've walked away from explaining to us why we're talking about this, right? So this is that place where now you have to say, okay, I've talked about sacrifice. And then you say, okay, Angelica, why are we talking about this? And you're going to be like, okay, so the thing that I was trying to say here, the thing I wanted to show you was that the hero sacrifices so that we learn that we need to sacrifice in our own lives. So we aspire to be like the superhero. You got to say that here, right? And if you don't say that, then you're just saying lots of facts about Superman, but the reader doesn't really understand why you're doing that, right? Here I put, but they are in the comics. So you say that Superman sacrifices, but they're not in the comic books. Now, there's plenty of places in the comic books in which Superman makes pretty significant sacrifices. So I do want you to use the text, and I do want you to back that up. Okay. Now, we're on page 4 now. And remember, this is a 4 to 6 page essay. And here I put, so we've grown very repetitive. You've said that Superman sacrifices, and you kind of just keep repeating that. He sacrifices, he sacrifices. Now you have to show, one, really good examples that backs that up, right? So number 1, just some really good concrete examples. Number 2, now you need to kind of move us on. What's the next developmental step, right? So remember that each paragraph has a very specific job to do, right? What's the next job that you're going to try to introduce to the reader? I would argue that this idea right here needs to be taken completely on its own. And then you would go from there